He crashed in the frozen wilderness of Alaska, trapped inside a mangled plane with no way to call for help. For 9 brutal winters, he battled starvation, frostbite, and the endless silence of the Arctic, clinging to life when rescue seemed impossible. How did one man survive nearly a decade alone in the deadliest cold on Earth? The wind over Alaska's Wrangell St. Elias range carried with it the kind of silence that could swallow a man whole. To fly here meant gambling with forces older and more powerful than steel or engines. And yet for Carl, it was the only life he knew. He was a bush pilot, one of those rare souls who ferried supplies, hunters, and medicine to places where no road reached and no telephone line ever stretched. He had spent decades crisscrossing the frontier, guiding his little single-engine plane through valleys carved by glaciers, over rivers braided like silver threads, and into villages so remote they existed only as dots on outdated maps. It was November, and snow had begun its reign, blanketing the land in a silence so complete that even the wolves seemed to howl less often. Carl rose before dawn, the frost still glittering on the wings of his aircraft, his breath a fog in the bitter air. He had a load of provisions to deliver farther inland, and he had every expectation of returning to his cabin by nightfall. It was routine, almost dull to a man so used to danger. That confidence, though, would soon prove fatal. By midday, the weather began to shift. The horizon, which at first had been crisp with mountains, blurred into a gray curtain. Clouds swelled like bruises against the sky, heavy with snow. The altimeter ticked downward, as Carl kept low, skimming the ridges to stay below the storm. He knew the signs. He had seen blizzards born from nothing, swallowing the land whole within an hour. His radio hissed and crackled, then fell silent. The compass needle spun erratically. A strange unease gripped him. Still, he pressed forward. There was no turning back now. The storm was already closing in behind. The first gust struck like a slap, jolting the plane sideways. Snow battered the windshield, dense enough to blot out everything but the trembling hands on the controls. He had flown blind before, trusting instinct and instruments, but this storm was unlike any other. Wind screamed through the mountains, tearing at the wings, rattling bolts loose. Then, like a death knell, came the sputter. The engine coughed once, caught, then sputtered again. Carl's heart lurched. He adjusted the choke, tried the fuel mixture, begged the machine with every trick he knew. But the sputter grew into silence, the propeller slowing, then freezing in the blizzard's grip. For a moment, there was only the whistling of wind and the sudden terrifying drop as gravity claimed its due. Trees appeared out of the storm, black spires rushing upward. Carl yanked at the controls, pulling the nose up in a desperate bid to soften the crash. Branches tore at the fuselage. The left wing clipped a rock outcrop and sheared away. The cabin screamed with twisting metal, the windshield shattered into a spray of ice. And then, with a final bone-shaking jolt, the little plane slammed into the mountainside and came to rest in a spray of snow and splintered aluminum. Silence followed, heavy and unbroken, as though the world itself had inhaled and refused to exhale again. When Carl opened his eyes, the first thing he felt was pain, sharp, searing, radiating from his right leg. His ankle had twisted badly, perhaps fractured, but he could still move it. Blood trickled down his temple, freezing against his skin. He forced himself upright, groaning as broken ribs stabbed at his lungs. The cabin was torn open, snow already drifting inside. Beyond the jagged edges of metal, the storm raged on, burying the wreck inch by inch. He realized with a chill deeper than the cold outside that no signal had been sent, no beacon lit. Nobody knew where he had gone down. That night he fought against despair. He ripped insulation from the walls of the plane, shoving it inside his jacket. He found a wool blanket in the supply cargo, wrapped it around himself, and scavenged for anything that might burn. With frozen fingers he struck sparks, praying for flame. At last a tiny ember caught on shredded paper, then grew, licking upward. He fed it splinters from the wreck until a weak fire flickered, the only thing separating him from death. He curled around it like an animal, shivering so violently his teeth clattered against each other. Outside, the storm screamed, but Carl clung to life with stubborn determination. He whispered into the dark, promising himself that the fire would never die, that he would see another sunrise. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world of white, so bright it burned his eyes. His plane was half buried, the wings mangled, the radio crushed. He hobbled outside on his injured leg, scanning the sky for search planes. None came. He shouted once, the sound vanishing into the void. And then he understood. The wilderness had swallowed him whole, and only his will stood between life and death. The first days became a blur of tasks, each essential, each exhausting. Carl dragged supplies from the wreck: flour, beans, coffee, and a hunting rifle. It was not much, certainly not enough for the months he knew might pass before help arrived. He pulled the fuselage into a crude shelter, patching holes with snow and branches. Inside, he laid out what he had: one wool blanket, a handful of tins, a few dozen bullets, and a battered logbook. He knew survival was not about comfort. It was about structure, about ritual, about refusing to surrender to chaos. Every morning before dawn, he stoked the fire back to life from the embers he had carefully buried beneath ash. He boiled snow for water, his lips already cracking from dehydration. He tested his leg, hobbling farther each day to scout the terrain. The world around him was brutal, a cathedral of ice and stone where the sun rose late and set early, where the silence was so deep that his own breath sounded like thunder. Yet in that silence he began to learn. He set snares for snowshoe hares, following their tiny tracks through the powder. He fashioned crude fishing gear from twisted aluminum, chiseling holes in the ice to drop lines into black water. When he caught his first trout, he wept as though it were a miracle. Weeks passed, and still no rescue came. The snow buried the plane almost completely, leaving only a metal hump visible above the drifts. Carl marked the days in his logbook, scrawling entries that grew shorter as the ink froze and his fingers stiffened. Sometimes he wrote only a single word: alive. Other times, when hunger clawed at him or the cold pressed so close he feared it would snuff him out, he wrote his fears plainly: too weak, fire low, hope fading. Yet the act of writing gave him purpose. It meant he existed. By the second month, reality settled on him with crushing weight. The search had ended. No one was coming. He remembered stories of pilots lost in these mountains, their planes discovered decades later by hikers, their remains frozen in time. He realized he was now one of them, unless he became something more. Survival ceased to be temporary. It became permanent. He had to learn not just to endure, but to live here. Spring brought no reprieve. Meltwater turned the snow to slush, soaking his boots, making every step a battle. Bears woke from their dens, prowling near his camp, sniffing at the caches where he dried meat. Once, a grizzly raided his stores, scattering months of food across the snow. Carl fired warning shots until it fled, but his heart sank as he gathered what scraps he could. Starvation loomed again. He grew thin, his cheeks hollow, his beard tangled and wild. His hands cracked until they bled, yet he continued to set snares, continued to fish, continued to build fire after fire, in defiance of the endless cold. Summer came briefly, the tundra bursting with color, wildflowers scattering across meadows like spilled paint. Carl trapped beavers, dried their pelts, stockpiled what food he could. He followed caribou herds, not daring to waste bullets but learning their paths, studying the land as though it were a living map. The aurora lit the skies at night, green flames dancing across the heavens, reminding him that even in desolation, beauty endured. He spoke to the lights sometimes, to the wreck, to the rifle he carried like a companion. Solitude pressed on him, heavy as ice, yet he refused to let madness take him. And then the snow returned. Another winter, another season of darkness. His logbook entries slowed, but his fire still burned. His body grew harder, leaner, his movements precise and instinctive. He became a creature of the wilderness. His life measured not by hours or days, but by rituals. Check traps, melt snow, guard fire, endure the night. He had become, in a sense, timeless, living outside the world of men. Yet deep within him, a spark endured the dream that one day he would see another human face, hear another voice, and walk again in a world that had long forgotten him. Winter returned like a verdict, abrupt and absolute, swallowing the last color from the land, and replacing it with a horizon of white that erased distance and time. The plane was a buried whale now, only the warped ridge of the fuselage showing when the wind shaved the drifts low. Carl tunneled in and out on his knees, packing the passage with snow so it wouldn't collapse, learning the strange geometry of living inside winter. He lined the tunnel with spruce boughs cut from a stunted stand a quarter-mile downslope, carrying them in bundles lashed with rawhide strips made from beaver hide. Each step on that run was a negotiation. His healed leg ached in cold like iron splitting under a hammer, but it held, and he trusted it the way a climber trusts an old rope warily, with gratitude. Fire remained religion. He nested the coals at night in a cradle of punk wood and ash, capped with a flat stone warmed by the flames, a trick he discovered by accident when he noticed how embers survived longer under weight. In the morning he breathed life into the pulse of orange, like blowing on a sleeping child's hands. Patient, never hurried, never careless. A moment's carelessness out here could mean a night without heat, and a night without heat could mean the end of everything. Hunger settled not as a sensation but as a climate. He rationed the last fist of flour across a calendar of knots he had tied into a length of snare wire, 1 knot per day, tightening the line 1 notch every sunrise to keep his bargain with himself. He learned which inner bark peeled cleanest for cordage, which twigs snapped with a dry report even when the forest was entombed in frost. He learned that snow has a voice, powder hisses, wind slab groans, crust snaps like pottery, and those voices became a vocabulary of safety. Once, crossing a drift that filled a small gully, he heard the belly-deep thump of a slab settling, and threw himself flat, spreading weight, feeling the whole hill flex beneath him. He lay there until the sound ceased and the mountain's breath steadied, then inched on like a lizard, promising the white slope that he would not insult it with haste again. The mind became a second wilderness. Silence pressed so hard at night that his own heartbeat sounded like a drum in a distant camp. He spoke to keep the edges of himself from fraying, not in madness but in maintenance, addressing the rifle, the kettle, the little dented mirror he used to check frostbite on his cheeks. He made a habit of reciting facts, aloud, constellation names, the phonetic alphabet, the layout of a carburetor, as if knowledge itself were kindling. On the worst days, when stormlight never matured beyond a dull twilight and snow sifted steadily into his tunnel, no matter how he packed it, he read the logbook back to himself, page by page. The earlier entries felt like letters from another man. He did not allow himself to pity that man. He simply honored him by staying alive. Nutrition threatened to betray him more subtly than cold. He woke one morning with his gums tender and bleeding, a sweetness in his breath he didn't trust. He remembered a trapper's lesson and began simmering spruce tips and rose hips into a bitter, resinous tea that stained his cup and steadied his mouth. He chewed willow for its medicine when a fever took him for 2 days, sweating and shivering in alternating tides. He cut the toes from a spare pair of socks and stitched them onto his mittens as patches, sewing with a bone needle honed from a beaver rib and thread spun from sinew. He cut narrow slits in a piece of birch bark and tied it across his eyes with rawhide snow goggles to tame the glare. He learned that every inconvenience could be converted, with patience, into a tool. Predators came and went like weather. A wolf pack trotted past his camp one blue noon when the air rang with cold, their bodies flowing over the drifts with a grace that humbled him. They glanced once toward the low smoke from his pipe and dismissed him the way the sea dismisses a pebble. Bears were different. Even sleeping, they haunted the edge of the tree line, snow caves breathing faint puffs that showed where a den lay under a drift. He hung meat high when he had it, using a pulley of knotted line and an ice-smooth boulder as a counterweight, and smeared the rope with ashes to make it unpalatable. He never forgot the earlier raid that had halved his stores in a single night, and he never again allowed himself to be careless with a cache. Spring broke its knuckles against the range, and then suddenly, it was everywhere. Snow rotting from beneath, creeks cutting black veins through the white. Meltwater found every weakness in his shelter, and insisted on becoming a river through the fuselage. He responded with carpentry kerf cuts in driftwood to bend it into hoops, bark peeled and stretched for lashing, a floor of split poles laid on shims so the highest water could pass under rather than through his bed. He smoked fish on a rack of green willow over a fire made sullen with damp alder, learning to read smoke the way he read snow. Thin blue meant progress, thick white meant wasted fuel. Time ceased to move in months and began to move in chores. He set a line of traps that described a ragged oval around his camp. A procession of hopes he walked daily, whether or not he believed any would spring. He dedicated one day a week to repair the logic of industry rather than desperation, mending a boot, welt before it failed, reshaping a snare trigger that had grown brittle, sharpening the knife he took from the emergency kit, so it would be a scalpel in his hand rather than a wedge. He learned the slope of the sun at midday in every season and scratched a gnomon into a flat stone, teaching himself a crude sundial that comforted him with the fact that rules still existed. The aurora taught him other rules. On certain nights, it arched so low he could convince himself he heard it whispering, a silk-on-silk hiss that might have been wind in distant poplar crowns, but that he allowed, just once in a while, to be something more. There were visitors from the old world once in a great while. In his third winter he heard a piston engine and erupted from the tunnel, with the wild, uncoordinated urgency of a drowning swimmer. The sky was scrubbed and hard, stars visible at noon, the kind of cold that makes sound travel like the snap of glass. He had prepared for this, a pyramid of green boughs in a stone ring, a match sealed in wax, rags soaked in animal fat. The first flare of flame leapt like a birth cry, and the smoke rose in a column that any trained eye would recognize as human. The plane curved along the valley too high, too fast, and was gone in a minute. A silver stitch pulled through blue cloth and vanished. He stood until his face burned with frostnip and the smoke became useless, and then he went back down the tunnel and sat on the floor beside the stove with his hands on his knees and breathed for a very long time. He adjusted something inside himself that day, not hope, which he refused to discard, but expectation. He learned to love the acts that might save him without needing them to succeed. Seasons visited and revisited, each time testifying to how far a human can be pared down and still remain human. His body was whittled to function, sinew and bone in economic collaboration. He built snowshoes with bent willow and babich thong, and crossed country that would have swallowed him as a younger man. He developed a patience so complete that he could sit over a stream hole and wait for a grayling to turn just right below the ice, the way a pale leaf turns when a current decides it should. He missed the color of conversation more than he missed bread. Sometimes he cupped his ear to the kettle lid as it trembled on the boil and pretended it was a crowded room, words overlapping, laughter at the far end. He never allowed the pretense to last long. You do not invite illusions to share a house with need. On the 9th winter's first real storm, the kind that arrives with conviction, he performed the same rituals he had devised in the first year, but he did them not as defense now, rather as ceremony. The tunnel reinforced, the wood stacked and grated by dryness, the gnomon stone brought inside, so it would not split. The flare kit checked and rechecked, though he had not seen a plane in months. When darkness pressed with its full weight, he lay on his side with the stove's door ajar and watched the fire write its old language on the aluminum walls. He recognized the words. They said endure, and they said listen. In the morning the storm's back was broken. The air was the clear, knife-bright blue that follows punishment. He shouldered the rifle, walked the trap line, and at the far end, near the lip of a small moraine he had come to like, he stopped all at once, not because of a track or a sound, but because of a pattern in the snow that did not belong. Down valley, across the white, a line of dots, like beads on a string, moved in a shallow S-curve, dark, deliberate, harnessed to something low and gliding. It took him a second to name them, because the word had burned away from disuse. Dogs, a team, and behind them, a sled, and behind that a figure growing larger, a bright scarf, flicking in the little wind like stitched flame. For the first time in years he shouted, not to test the size of his voice against the world, but to reach another person with it. The figure stopped, lifted an arm, and returned his wave. The line of beads straightened and began to climb toward him. They arrived with the vitality of a different planet. The dogs blowing steam into the crystalline air. The musher's face ruddied and alive, and framed in fur so lavish Carl's hands itched to touch it, just to verify the fact of it. The musher braked the sled and let the team fan out, each animal dropping to its belly in a practiced sprawl, tongues lolling like strips of bright cloth. "You all right?" the man called, and the sound of words aimed at him shuddered through Carl's chest. He tried to answer, and discovered that, though he had been speaking to kettles and rifles for years, his voice was a hinge that had not turned in a long while. "I'm here," he managed. Then again, better, "I'm here." The musher's eyes flicked over him in an inventory learned from Winters, the way a medic's eyes flick over a wounded man, counting exposed skin. The color of fingertips, the clarity in the pupils. Satisfied for the moment, he fished a thermos from the sled and pressed it into Carl's hands. The first sip of broth was a miracle and a hazard. Pleasure lurched toward nausea, and then settled into a heat that seemed to light his ribs from the inside. He laughed an astonished, boyish sound, and the dogs thumped their tails as if the laugh had been a command they recognized. Words came easier by the small fire the musher permitted himself, a stove of punched tin, rattling and cheerful. The man said he was part of a winter mail relay that skirted the edge of these mountains when weather closed the air to plains. He'd seen smoke here once in late fall, too thin to be a camp hunter's, too persistent, and the idea of a person living under that ridge had nested in his mind. He came back when the trail permitted. "Thought I'd been imagining you," he admitted, and Carl felt gratitude and an odd shyness that someone had been imagining him at all. They talked in pieces, Carl's story unspooling with stops where the names of things had worn thin. 9 winters, he said. The number sat in the air like a small, careful beast. Unbelievable until the musher used his boot heel to draw 9 little tick marks in the crust, and then nodded, as if the arithmetic satisfied him. Rescue was both immediate and slow. The musher had a radio. Not a toy, but a solid piece of field equipment, wrapped in waxed canvas and patience. He raised a station he called Toke after a few tries, trading call signs with a calm man who asked good questions and did not waste breath. A plan formed out loud while frost formed on mustaches, weather, fuel, skis, landing options. Too tight for a wheelplane. The musher relayed, maybe a ski plane on the lake, 3 miles west, if the wind behaved. Not today. A front coming in from the Gulf would tangle the pass by noon. Food drops? The musher looked at Carl, and then at the wreck's hump and said, "He's got a store." He didn't say what was true, that Carl had enough, if nothing went wrong, because he knew how to speak hope without insulting reality. For 2 days the musher stayed. He taught Carl the names of his dogs, and Carl repeated them until they felt like old cousins. He slept outside under a sky spiked with cold, his back to the sled as if guarding a small ship beached in a hostile port. Together they hauled the most necessary of Carl's belongings: logbook, rifle, a bundle of tools, a roll of pelts down to the lake, and stamped a runway with snowshoes, in a labor that turned both men into slow, steaming animals. Carl walked the length of that white strip again and again, memorizing its distance with the same stubborn thoroughness he had applied to trapline and tunnel. On the third morning, the sky paled in a way that meant weather was undecided. The musher crouched, tuned the radio, listened to a voice red wind like a psalm, and said, "If they're coming, it'll be now." He heard the airplane before he saw it, a rumor that thickened, then a fact that shivered the frozen air. It came in from the northwest, low and hungry-looking, skis gleaming like bone on its legs, and Carl felt a muscle deep under his ribs tense, as if preparing to jump. The pilot took one pass, then another, reading the lake the way a sailor reads surf, and on the third sweep the machine settled. Snow hissed under the skis. The engine coughed down into the heartbeat of idle, and the prop blurred to transparency. The pilot climbed out with a grin that made him look very young. "You must be Carl," he said, as if stepping onto a front porch. Carl shook his hand and felt both the human heat and the oil tang and the softness of glove leather textures that belonged to a world he had been repeating to himself for years, and that now proved themselves true again. Leaving felt like theft. He stood with his hand on the wreck's torn metal and considered the lives it had been: a shelter, a chapel, a companion whose groans and expansions and midnight ticks he knew better than any language. He placed the logbook on the seat, then picked it up again and slid it into his coat against his chest, because he couldn't bear to divorce his story from his body just yet. He bent, scooped a handful of snow, and packed it hard, then pressed it into the stove's mouth, killing the coals with a soft hiss. The sound felt ceremonial, like the last whisper at the end of a long prayer. The musher touched 2 fingers to the fuselage as he passed, respectful, and then they were walking toward the lake, with the dogs brushing their calves, and then they were loading, and then the pilot was pointing at straps and buckles and saying loud things about weight and trim that Carl heard and obeyed, and then the engine found its fierce voice and the world began to slide under them. From the air the valley looked newly made, as if a hand had just lifted from smoothing its surface. Carl saw the line of his trap route stitched among dwarf willows, the little dark quotient that was his tunnel's mouth, the smoke stain he had painted into the snow during lonely, earnest years. He put his hand flat on the window, without meaning to. The plane rose, the lake became a medallion, and then a coin, and then an idea. The range opened its ribs and let them pass. Civilization did not roar, in so much as it layered itself back onto him, sound first, then smell, then the tyranny and mercy of clocks, a clinic with heat that made his bones ring, a cot with sheets that rasped his palms, clean water that came when asked, and lights that could be persuaded on and off with a small switch. People came, kind and disciplined, and touched him gently as if he were glass, and he learned to answer their questions without looking over their shoulders for a stove or a storm. He ate too much, and was taught to eat less. He slept through the night once and woke strangled by quiet, and then slept with a radio murmuring weather under his pillow, which soothed him. His beard came off in a nurse's practiced handfuls, and his face beneath it was not the face he remembered from before, but something carved by weather and endurance, and economies too pure for town life. Reporters arrived, as if delivered by the same routes as antibiotics and oranges. They asked for 90 seconds of hero, for a pull quote that would make a headline ring. He obliged in his way, which was to say he spoke of fire, and of doing the next thing instead of the whole thing, and of the way the land would tolerate your mistakes right up until it didn't. He did not inventory every private calculus of fear and ritual and grief, because not everything should be translated. When a Boy Scout asked him what he missed most, he surprised himself by saying voices in rooms, and the boy wrote it down in block letters on a merit badge worksheet like a spell. He visited the hangar where the ski plane lived and put both hands on its smooth cowling and thanked it the way a parishioner touches a saint's statue. He wrote the mushers' names, man and dogs, in the front of the logbook and mailed a copy of the pages to a little library in a valley town that sits under a mountain with a name Carl always liked to say. He didn't speak of going back. People expected sentiment to pull him to the wreck, but his sentiment was in the doing, not the shrine. If he returned someday, it would be for the work of it, for the discipline of tightening what time had loosened, for the pleasure of leaving a cache well built where a stranger might someday need it. Spring came again, this time with the smell of wet wood in boardwalks and the oily sweetness of diesel around skiffs in a harbor. Carl walked with a cane until his leg forgave him, and then without. He began to wake in the half-light just before dawn and catch himself listening for the furnace of his old stove. He would smile, turn on a lamp with one finger, and count the things he had insisted on keeping the kettle scarred black: the bone needle in a film canister, the birch bark visor with its narrow slits that had saved his eyes. He kept the rifle, too, not because he needed it, but because the geometry of its weight over his palm contained a chapter of his life better than any photograph. When he finally read the logbook aloud to a room full of people in a little museum, he found that the sentences he'd written in a tight, cramping hand had a music that made sense only when spoken slowly. The audience leaned forward when he described the first winter's tunnel, the aurora's whisper, the time the bear's breath smoked into the entrance like a ghost. They went very still when he told the truth about the day the airplane passed too high and he learned the difference between hope and expectation. They laughed where he had not expected laughter at the kettle lid conversation, at the way the dogs thumped their tails at his laugh, and in that laughter he recognized the thing he had missed most: the braid of many lives, making one rope strong enough to lift a man. He ended without drama, because drama belongs to weather and wilderness, not to a podium under electric lights. He closed the book and told them the only instruction that had never failed him: do the next right thing, no matter how small, and do it as if someone you love were depending on it, because they are, even if that someone is your own stubborn heart. When the room stood and clapped, he looked down at his hands, which were not trembling, and he allowed himself to receive the noise the way he had once received fire, on a night when snow beat the walls and every breath was a choice. Years later, on a winter day clean enough to cut, he stood at the edge of a river with children who were not his, but who asked him the kind of questions that rebuild the world. He showed them how to cup a match from the wind, how to tell ash from ember by the way it rests, how to read the slope by the sound of a step. He did not make a sermon of it. He simply did the acts until the children's hands learned them. When a plane passed low and wagged its wings, the children waved, and Carl did too, not from need now, but from gratitude. The plane tilted and climbed. The river kept talking under its new skin of ice. The land listened without judgment. He had not conquered it. No one does. He had survived inside it, which is a different verb and a better one, and he carried that verb the way one carries a match in a storm, close, careful, and ready to be given away.